This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Thank you all very much for your attendance. My name is Alex White. I'm Director General here at the Institute. And this is our last event before the break in August. So just if I could take the opportunity to thank all of our members and supporters for their interest and their attendance during the last period. We've had a very busy few months. Some very interesting and stimulating talks here in the building. And of course, we have our events online as well. So we've had great support and interest. So thank you so much for that. Welcome all this afternoon to what I know is going to be a most interesting and stimulating talk by our guest of honor, Alexander Vindman, who's here, and Mary Cross, my colleague, is going to chair the event, and I'll hand over to her just in a moment. But just again, a warm welcome to all. And I don't like necessarily singling people out, but it's great to have the Commissioner of Garda Síochána, Drew Harris, with us, and others that I see. But if I start naming, I will leave somebody out. So I'll just mention the Commissioner and recognise his presence. And thank you very much for your attendance. It's my pleasure to hand over now to Mary Cross to chair this event. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Alex. And indeed, it's my pleasure to reiterate a warm welcome to you today for this exceptionally important topic, the Russian-Ukrainian war, its cause, conduct, and geopolitical context. And I'm very pleased to welcome for this discussion Dr. Alexander Vindman, who's the former Director for European Affairs in the US National Security Council. And against the background of the continuing war in Ukraine, the continuing tragedy of Russian continuing to target civilians, and the discussion very active in the West as to how best to support Ukraine in the continuing and ongoing war, this discussion indeed is as important as it is timely. And for your time, Dr. Vindman, and for being here, we would like to thank you. Just a couple of rules of the House. Dr. Vindman will speak to us for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll go to question and answer with our audience. We would appreciate if you could indicate your name and affiliation if you're asking a question. To those in the room, if you put up your hands, and we will ensure that you have a microphone. And to those many who are joining us on Zoom today, please feel free to post questions as they occur to you, and you can use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. Today's presentation and the Q&A are both on the record, and you can join the discussion on X using the handle at IIEA. I'd just like to formally introduce Dr. Vindman, who has joined us from a holiday in the west of Ireland, where he experienced Irish weather. So I think he might be suffering somewhat the effects of that, but thank you. So Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Alexander Vindman is a retired US Army Lieutenant Colonel. He was the Director for European Affairs at the White House's National Security Council from 2018 to 2020. Before that, he served as the Political Military Affairs Officer for Russia, for the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and as an attaché also at the US Embassy in Moscow and Kyiv. While on the Joint Staff, he co-authored the National Military Strategy Russia Annex. He earned an MA from Harvard University, where he serves as a Hauser Leader, and a PhD from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where he is currently a Senior Fellow. And Dr. Vindman leads the national security think tank, the Institute for Informed American Leadership. He is also an executive board member for the Renewed Democracy Initiative, a Senior Fellow at the Kettering Foundation, and a Senior Advisor to VoteVets. You probably wonder how he fits in all those activities. His best-selling memoir is titled Here, Right Matters, and that was published in 2021. And I should have mentioned at the beginning that Dr. Vindman was born in Ukraine and moved to the United States when he was 3 years old. So we're very interested to hear your informed and background knowledge on this current conflict, Dr. Vindman. So the floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Alex. Minister. Pleasure having you here. So I think we'll have a robust conversation. It could be about U.S. politics. I know that's it's a hobby here to watch U.S. politics and the implications of our elections on Russia-Ukraine war, frankly, on geopolitics at large. But I just finished up my doctoral. When I finished up my doctoral dissertation, it was on the topic of U.S. policy towards Russia and Ukraine since 1991. And while I wrote it from the standpoint of a former U.S. policymaker, I think a lot of the lessons learned can be extrapolated to the way that Europe as a whole kind of conducted its foreign policy with regards to Ukraine. And I think that when we started our post-Soviet relations, we had a legacy behind us. We had a legacy of Cold War. We had a legacy of recognition of Soviet power, and we had a buy-in to Russia's sense of exceptionalism. So those narratives were quite critical. They carried through for the first 35 years. They carried through to critical moments around our decisions around Ukraine's independence, around Ukraine's denuclearization, around the Orange Revolution, around the start of the war in 2014, carried through to 2022, carried through to today. And so those artifacts of our understanding have to do with Russia's kind of unique place in the world. Largest country by size, vast nuclear arsenal, once considered a competent conventional military, seemingly endless resources. Those are part of the narrative that compelled us to, didn't have to, but certainly result in us buying into a Russian sense of exceptionalism, wanting the West as a rule to cater towards preserving, enhancing relationships with Moscow at the expense of potential opportunities with other countries in the region, including significant countries like Ukraine, which was a country of 50 million people, significant industrial potential, but we didn't necessarily fully understand that Ukraine was a separate sovereign, independent state. I think there's a Russian narrative here also at play. For the Russians, Russian identity centered around Great Russia, Moscow, the Russian Federation territory as it's recognized today, Belarus, the White Russians, and then the Little Russians, Ukrainians, which is what they referred to the Ukrainians as, and that really Ukraine wasn't a sovereign independent state. It was just a political fluke that Ukraine ended up independently. And you could see that play out in the decisions that the U.S. made relatively early on, catering to maintaining Russian coherence over what was at one point a Russian empire or the former Soviet space. When President Bush Sr. showed up to Ukraine in the summer of 1991, just really months before the Soviet Union collapsed in December, he talked about rampant nationalism run amok and counseled against it on the basic notion that it was in U.S. interests to preserve a Russian control, Kremlin control over the periphery. That's a critical narrative that still carries forward, less so now, but certainly through the earlier part of these 35 years of post-Soviet relationships, not fully understanding that Ukraine has actually been involved in a struggle which might resonate with the population here for its own independence for hundreds of years. Ukraine was the cradle of Slavic civilization in a lot of ways. Kievan Rus, which predated the foundation of Russia by hundreds of years, was the regional power in there. It ended up falling apart in the early 13th century because the Mongol hordes sacked and destroyed. Well, it was infighting amongst the princes in the region, but the city ended up getting sacked in the beginning part of the 13th century, which allowed space for Moscow to emerge in its own right. And then Ukraine existed in the context of parts of other empires, the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, part of it occupied by the Ottoman Empire. This relationship became most defined in the 17th century where Ukraine started to develop its own was looking to define itself as an independent state, casting around for allies, looking to counter the dominance of the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, and looked towards the friendly-looking Russian Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox Moscow, and thought that they were signing up for a marriage of convenience. Instead, from the Russian perspective, subscribing to Russian power and domination. So this is the history. Certainly, we could say the last 350 years, at least, is a part modern history, the context of Ukraine fighting for its independence, aggressively fighting for its independence and achieving some level of independence at the tail end of World War I, where Ukraine ended up becoming an independent state for a brief flash, several years. And then when the communists came in, recognizing that they would have to contend with a thorn of Ukrainian nationalism, accepted a whole host of sovereign, not sovereign, but nationalist states. That's where you have the formation of these 15 republics. It was Ukraine and Georgia specifically that insisted on national sovereignty, that compelled the creation of the Soviet Union in not as a communist Soviet empire, post-Soviet empire, but as 15 republics. And that was the seed of Ukrainian independence in 1991. That regional national identity that the Ukrainians were, even under Soviet pressure, were able to nurture. But that's not a context that really was accepted or understood in the West. The context that was understood was Russian exceptionalism. So you have this really interesting dynamic in which the Russian narrative is adopted and is the narrative that seems to carry forward, rather than the Ukrainian narrative, which at moments actually achieved its own sovereignty and independence, whether it's the early part of the 20th century or the late part of the 20th century. The Russians will contend that Ukraine is not a valid state. It's in Putin's conception, it was a mistake for Lenin to have adopted a republic format to the Soviet Union, but that's a result of struggle on the Ukrainians to define themselves as sovereign and independent entity. I mentioned this because these are some of the narratives that seem to carry even forward to today. Another narrative that's critical is that it was the West that provoked this war. It was the NATO enlargement that provoked this war. We negate the fact that it was the sovereign independent states in Eastern Europe that demanded security because they had the experience of being subject to the Soviet imperialism, Soviet colonization in the post-World War II era. These are countries with independent agency, and they flex their muscles, including Poland going so far as to make noises about pursuing its own nuclear deterrent, which was one of the reasons that the West was swayed to accept the NATO enlargement to include Poland in the first round. And it was something that the Ukrainians felt acutely too. They were subject to Russian and then Soviet power for extended periods of time. And that's why in 2008, the US made some half steps in terms of considering NATO expansion to include Ukraine and Georgia. It was not, but this was should be understood as half steps at best, where there was a long-term view of Ukraine joining NATO, but there was no concrete plan. So there was no real pretext for Russia to conduct either the 2014 invasion or 2022 invasion. It was entirely about Russian identity and drawing Ukraine back into the fold. So I wanted to spend a brief moment talking about those important narratives, because even here in Dublin for the past couple of days, I've heard this narrative about, well, is Ukraine really its own independent state? Is Ukraine, isn't NATO enlargement the reason for this war? Those are Russian propagated narratives that have received some purchase in the Western world. and they require, I think they require some time to address those. Now, in terms of the war, where are we now? Where are we now? We've gone through several campaign cycles in this war. The first one, driven by Russian hubris and Russian chauvinism over Russian power versus Ukrainian power, was this idea of a flash shock and awe war that would quickly subdue Ukraine. The Ukrainians operating under their own strength with little help from the West. That should be absolutely clear. The US provided a small number of anti-tank systems, a limited number of air defense, tactical air defense systems, was able to resist a Russian seizure of the entirety of the country and expel Russia from around Kyiv and expel Russia from around Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city. In this moment, the US and NATO decided to accelerate support in the summer of 2022, but in half measures and fits and starts, buying into this sense of exceptionalism, again, buying into the fact that we needed to somehow look past a short war towards a long-term relationship with Russia as the exceptional power in the region, and arrested the ability to provide Ukraine with sufficient support. It was that sense of exceptionalism. It was the buy-in to Russian might and the fears over a Russian nuclear saber-rattling, the fears of escalation that arrested support in a critical juncture in which Russia was off balance. Russia didn't have a theory of victory. Its theory of victory, which is quick snatch and grab, faltered. And then they settled in on attritional warfare. And that's been going on for now about 2 years, at least a year and a half. Russia is still not achieving, doesn't really have a concrete theory of victory. Russia is not achieving significant military gains on the battlefield. There is one or two directions where they're making some significant tactical gains, but those are not going to fundamentally change the outcomes of this war or drive towards a conclusion. So we 2.5 years on, we're at a dilemma. Russia's theory of victory has faltered, but what is the Western theory of victory? What is US? What is NATO's theory of victory? And here I have a prescription. Again, since I write strategies, I have an idea of a vision that we could cast that brings us much closer to the negotiation phase than the muddling through that we're experiencing currently. And this is the idea of a hold, build, strike approach, holding Russia's withholding or withstanding Russia's onslaught right now over the course of the rest of this year, which the Ukrainians are doing okay at right now, with F-16s coming in within the next within weeks. That'll further enable the Ukrainian defense. They need to get some sure-footedness because they're a little bit off balance in one particular direction. I have confidence that they'll be able to do that. They've been dynamic and innovative thus far, although they're spread thin and the troops are worn out. But that only gets us to kind of a steady state. What is the next step? The next step is a doubling down on mobilization. That's manpower. Ukraine probably needs to draw about 300,000 troops in to fill the losses within the ranks, create new units, build a strike force, and then mobilize the economy. There are a lot of things they could be doing right now in terms of really doubling down on success in terms of drone warfare. That's strategic, operational, and tactical drone manufacturing. And then what could the West do? The West could invest in these in Ukraine's drone warfare. It could also pass additional masses of equipment forward to Ukraine under a theory that successful battlefield operations by the latter half of next year could drive towards negotiation. We could make some investments in that kind of strategy. And we could pass pre-positioned stocks, brigade sets of pre-positioned stocks. I don't want to get too technical, but we're talking about something that equips about 5,000 troops with robust pieces of hardware. And then we need to undertake some training of the Ukrainian armed forces to better conduct combined arms operations, something that we have not done. We've done basic training. We've not done the complex planning, synchronization, coordination work that you would get from highly trained staffs that can bring in all the resources required for successful operations to breach fixed fortifications, armor, infantry, artillery, air defense, electronic warfare, engineers, all synchronized like a fine-tuned orchestra at one point in time to achieve a breakthrough. And then plan for successes. You have to have all the logistics in place. And then we need to help the Ukrainians fix all the masses of equipment that we provided, but we haven't provided them the spare parts to sustain it. So all this amounts to an ability to hold what the Ukrainians have right now, build over the course of the next year, and strike out in the second half of next year to set conditions for successful negotiations. That plus the tailwinds of a U.S. Democratic administration could set the conditions for a negotiation phase.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.